Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. As you've just been told, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an academic. The Emeritus Fellow is a purely honorary title. I was a professional diplomat for 30 years or so. And I come at this with a background in politics and economics from Trinity College Dublin, so I have a little bit of a feeling for the economist's way of viewing the world as compared to the political practitioner's way of viewing the world. There are two kinds of sanctions, of course, at this level. There are sanctions which are imposed under the authority of UN Security Council resolutions, that is to say universal sanctions. And secondly, there are sanctions imposed by powerful nations or groups of nations, which are almost always led by the United States and with a predominantly European Union membership. And these groups are often described as coalitions of the willing. I was looking for a good way to start this address, and President Vladimir Putin gave me my opening. I happened to see a very interesting documentary the other day online called Crimea: The Way Home, which tells the story from Russia's point of view of the events of last year in the Ukraine, which culminated in the secession of Crimea, its incorporation into Russia, and of course the continuing fighting in the eastern provinces. And President Putin, during this very long but interesting film, was asked by the interviewer, if you had your chance, would you do it any differently? And he replied with some force, I could have acted no other way. And when they tell us about sanctions and so on, sanctions are a bad thing. Sanctions should have been imposed on those who organized a coup d'etat and helped the junta in Kiev. As for us, we were acting in the interests of the Russian people and the whole country. To trade that for money, to trade people for some financial benefit, to trade people for some new contracts or bank transfers, it's absolutely unacceptable. If we allow ourselves to follow this logic, we will lose everything. We will lose the whole country. It doesn't mean we shouldn't respect international law and our Western partners' interests, but it means that all our partners should respect Russia and its interests too. So Putin's pretty clear on all that. Russia won't be bullied. Russia won't be threatened. By way of contrast, I found an American briefing paper, What Are Economic Sanctions, by a senior editor at the United States Council for Foreign Relations. And it's remarkable reading that article how Jonathan Masters assumes United States hegemonic power as a global rule-making state. And in fact, I think there's very little difference in his mind from UN sanctions imposed under the Security Council authority and coalition of the willing sanctions decided upon by the United States and its friendly partners, which, by the way, very usually includes my country, Australia, although I find myself in contradiction to most of these policies. Masters' position is that whatever the US considers it must do, it needs no justification. Essentially, American might is right. If the UN Security Council option fails due to a permanent member veto of the sanction policy, the US can simply set up a coalition of the willing. And nowadays, it seems, the US can even sanction its own Security Council partners, and I'll come to that later in my address. So it's a very calm assumption of American global hegemony, which really is central to this whole discussion you'll be having today. And of course, what the coalition of the willing is now doing to Russia over the Ukraine, it could, in theory, try to do to China tomorrow over another issue. So to be a permanent member of the Security Council is no protection, it seems, against sanctions imposed by a coalition of the willing. Here are a few quotes from Masters. In his introduction, he says, governments and multinational bodies impose economic sanctions to try to alter the strategic decisions of state and non-state actors that threaten their interests or violate international norms of behaviour. So here are the two yardsticks, threatening their interests or violating international norms of behaviour. And he suggests that sanctions have become the defining feature of the Western response to several geopolitical challenges, including Iran's nuclear program and Russia's intervention in the Ukraine. He notes that the United States uses sanctions more than any other country, and of course the use of sanctions has increased enormously since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1990 and the end of the bipolar world model. Masters asked whether sanctions work, and he gives 4 criteria, and one of which suggests that sanctions might simply be intended as an expression of opprobrium, which is really remarkable. Sanctions as if you like, a moral reprimand, without any intention of success. So, in conclusion, he summarizes expert recommendations for best practice. Develop a well-rounded approach, balance diplomatic carrots and sticks. Set attainable goals. If you aim for regime change, obviously you won't get cooperation from the intended recipient. Build multilateral support and be flexible. Let's go right back to the beginning. How did sanctions start? Well, I suggest they started in ancient and medieval times with warfare. Very often cities were laid siege to. They closed their gates and declined to be occupied. The invading force decided to starve them out. And that, to me, is a form of economic warfare. It's a sanction against the people of that city. Surrender to us or we will destroy you. And we will do it by peaceful means that don't involve sacrificing our own soldiers and our own weapons. But of course these sieges were very cruel. And they were successful, generally speaking, when they followed Jonathan Masters' principles, that they balanced sticks and carrots, slavery and starvation if the defenders resisted, but their lives and maybe freedom if they surrendered. And so the settlement offers had to be credible, no breaking of promises. So there needed to be some integrity in the whole process of laying siege. The next landmark, I suppose, is the Treaty of Westphalia, which laid down a principle after 100 years of bloody civil war in Europe on religious grounds that states were answerable for what they did in their own territories to their own citizens. And this is the famous Westphalian doctrine of national sovereignty, which Henry Kissinger still totally believes in. Every attempt at international cooperation since then has been, at least formally, based on the Treaty of Westphalia's respect for national sovereignty of all states, large and small. We had a change, of course, after the end of the Cold War. Suddenly, the United States became the global hegemonic power. And suddenly it became possible for the United States and the countries that, broadly speaking, shared its values to say, well, hang on, Westphalia is all very well, but there are international standards, international values. We have to start thinking about the protection of those universal values. And my own Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, became very seized of the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, R2P, by which he meant the responsibility that if a state is not protecting its own citizens, other states have the right to come in, violating Westphalia, and take charge. And this was all tested, of course, in the breakup of Yugoslavia. Initially, the secession of the Serbians and the Slovenians and the Macedonians was done peacefully under a UN Security Council resolution. But then, when everything started to go pear-shaped, Russia decided, no, we're going to veto any further interference in what's happening in the former Yugoslavia. And so the interventions to do something about the ethnic cleansing in the Serbian Krajina region of Croatia, the sectarian warfare in Bosnia, and finally the sectarian warfare in Kosovo, were all handled by the West by coalitions of the willing. And this was, if you like, a major threshold that was crossed here of a coalition of the willing proceeding despite a Russian veto and actually in the heart of Europe to constrain the sovereignty of the Milosevic regime in Belgrade. Going back a moment, I'm amused to think about the Napoleonic Wars, because I'm a great fan of the Patrick O'Brian novels, Master and Commander. I know them very well. And the blockades of continental Europe by the Royal Navy were, of course, interferences with trade by force, a violation of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, free trade doctrines, all those things. And yet Britain said, we're going to do this, we have the power at sea to do this, we are going to win this. We are going to deprive Napoleonic Europe of gold from the colonies, of tea, of spices, of sugar, all those things that make life pleasant, and we hope this will help us win the war. Well, of course, it didn't. In the end, it took the invasion of Russia and the subsequent retreat from Moscow to break Napoleon's power. But the naval blockade was very successful, and it was an effective sanction. In a way, the British naval power, the Pax Britannica, which Britain rules the waves, that attitude was inherited by the United States. I'm truncating history enormously here. And we now have a sort of a Pax Americana, this calm assumption that our values are correct and whatever we regard as unacceptable is unacceptable, and we will do whatever has to be done about it. So when we came through the 20th century, we had the terrible world wars, World War I and World War II. And after World War I, in particular, Western nations believed that there was another way to avoid this terrible carnage of war. Let's do economic sanctions if anybody misbehaves. Well, of course, the problem with that was that the League of Nations had no coercive powers. It didn't have a collective security system under the authority of a powerful Security Council. So when the first big problem came along, the Italian aggression in Somalia and Ethiopia, Britain and France, the leading countries in the League, tried to impose sanctions on Italy. It was a dismal failure, and it led only to Italy leaving the League, Italy aligning itself more closely with Nazi Germany, and hastening the advent of World War II. And then, of course, that was the end of the League of Nations. There was another major failure of sanctions in that pre-World War II period, of course, the failure of American sanctions against Japan, as Japan pursued imperialist policies first in Manchuria, then against the coastal cities of China. America became increasingly displeased and started ratcheting up sanctions. Now, Japan didn't react in the way in which it was supposed to react. They didn't, if you like, behave as a rational economic actor. They behaved as a very patriotic, very emotional country, which took the view the Americans are trying to shut us out of what is rightfully our sphere of influence. We have to fight back. And then, of course, there came Pearl Harbor in 1941. And there's a very good article by Dr. Jeffrey Record on Japan's decision for war, which I summarize in some detail on pages 12 and 13. And it's clear that the sanctions were not working. And why were they not working? Well, in Record's conclusion, they failed to work for 4 reasons. Firstly, fear and honor, rational or not, can motivate as much as material interest. And I think we need to always be very conscious of this. We are not simply material, self-interested individuals. What we do is governed as much by our emotions as by our rational calculations. Secondly, there's no substitute for knowledge of a potential adversary's history and culture. Thirdly, deterrence lies in the mind of the deterred, not the deterrer. Strategy must always inform and guide operations. Economic sanctioning, and I stress this one, can be tantamount to an act of war. And 6, the presumption of moral or spiritual superiority can fatally discount the consequences of an enemy's material superiority, and this, of course, was the mistake Imperial Japan made. They felt they were spiritually superior to the corrupt United States. And finally, war can easily become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So then we come to the post-war period and the Cold War, and there was actually an initial Western sanctions regime against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which I, as a practicing diplomat, had to take part in, which was COCOM, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. And the effort was to prevent Russia from Soviet Union from gaining access to any technology or material considered of potential strategic significance. So we had to decide whether, when we were exporting minerals from Australia, whether certain minerals should be denied to the Soviet Union because of their potential strategic use. And I remember sitting on committees arguing about things like that. COCOM lasted until the fall of the Soviet Union. There were also, of course, sanctions against Cuba, but they didn't really have a desired effect. It didn't break Cuba because Cuba was sustained by friendly Warsaw Pact countries and by friendly countries in Latin America. Although they suffered an enormous drop in their standards of living, Cuba did survive. And now, of course, there's a détente and a rapprochement taking place finally after so many years between Cuba and the US. Of course, the great success of sanctions, in fact, I would say the only real success, is the anti-apartheid sanctions against South Africa. And this is a very familiar story. These sanctions were initially supported by, of course, the international human rights movement, increasingly powerful, and by many countries in the United Nations. But the powerful trading nations, nations like the United States, France, UK, Germany, also Israel, did not support them. They argued that apartheid was an internal matter and thus outside the scope of UN powers. I'm proud to say that my own Prime Minister at the time, Malcolm Fraser, God rest his soul, was very important and influential in taking on Margaret Thatcher and saying, no, this is a global moral issue. We have to do something about apartheid and we have to make these sanctions universal. And I think he had an impact. And over a course of years, apartheid became universally abhorred, and finally governments in Washington and London bowed to the inevitable, supported sanctions, and at that point the upholders of apartheid knew that the game was up, and very quickly apartheid ended and there was major regime change in South Africa, which I'm happy to say was a bloodless regime change. South Africa did not collapse in bloodshed as the pessimists had feared. So that sanctions regime, though it violated the Westphalia Conventions, it met all of Maastricht's tests for effective sanctions. And in the end it worked because it became universal. After the Cold War, there was a feeling that the UN collective security system could finally work as it was intended to, backed by a strong and united Security Council. And this is where my former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans comes in, working very hard with Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General, to try and apply in situations as diverse as Kosovo, Rwanda, Cambodia, the responsibility to protect doctrine. And they had a fair amount of success with that, but of course not total success. But then came Iraq, and the Iraq sanctions, as I see them, are a very poignant and sad story. Because although these sanctions did have UN Security Council support, and with the full authority of the Security Council, they never achieved their goal of protecting human rights and achieving peaceful regime change. They led only to 2 wars against Iraq. Sanctions were imposed to punish Iraq for allegedly having or seeking to acquire weapons of mass destruction. But the very efficient authoritarian Saddam regime was able to insulate its elite from the worst impact of these sanctions, and the poor and the sick bore the brunt of them. Efforts to make humanitarian exceptions to allow some Iraqi oil sales, with the money earmarked specifically to buy food and medical supplies for the sick in hospitals, were routinely abused by corrupt schemes that further enriched irresponsible international traders and regime cronies. Meanwhile, thousands of sick Iraqi children were dying in hospitals that were starved of resources. So we seem to be right back in the cruel world of medieval sieges. By any reasonable measure, sanctions against Iraq were a policy failure. Sanctions against Iran are an ongoing story even now. There are 2 sets of sanctions, those imposed by the UN Security Council only since 2006 in response to the allegations of a weapons program, and those imposed from much earlier on, as far back as 1979, by a coalition of the willing led by the United States. And now, of course, on pages 18 and 19, I give a bit of a state of play on where this is going. It's quite a complicated story. At the moment, it seems to me it could go either way. If UN Security Council sanctions are lifted, but US coalition of the willing sanctions remain in place, it seems to me that's not offering Iran very much of an incentive to do what the world wants it to do. I think the Iranians are quite correct when they say everything has to be lifted, UN and coalition sanctions, or else there's no deal. So I'll leave you to talk about that later in the day. I'm sure Iran will come up. But there's now so much ill will and suspicion between the US and Iran that it's hard to see any early resolution. And of course there are parties involved, third parties, who are very anxious to spoil this process, so I'm not hugely hopeful. Since 1990 there has been a proliferation of sanctions, as I've said, since the end of the Cold War. There are now 20 countries targeted by US coalition of the willing sanctions, and they've also been imposed under 5 transnational programs: non-proliferation, counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism, the rough diamond trade, and transnational criminal organizations. So basically, anybody who's involved in support of any of those activities from any country can be targeted by US sanctions. And this is serious stuff. And just to give you an example, there's a list in the article by Jonathan Masters, which I keep coming back to. He's done all my research for me. The largest fine imposed by the US so far is on the Banque Nationale de Paris, BNP Paribas, France's largest bank, which actually paid a fine of $8.9 billion to the United States after pleading guilty to money laundering for blacklisted Cuban, Iranian, and Sudanese entities. So this was the price for that bank of continuing to do business in the US, and they paid it. So clearly sanctions are moving out from bilateral political relations into the area you guys know all about, major commercial international transactions. I'm going to pretty much finish up on talking about the present sanctions against Russia because it's topical. Today's the 70th anniversary of the victory over the forces of Nazism. Major parade in Moscow today is being attended by only about 25 out of 65 invited heads of state. It has been, to my mind, shamefully boycotted by every significant Western European country. There are a few who are going, but not major ones. To me, this is immensely hurtful and immensely counterproductive. If anything's going to drive Russia into the arms of China and create a new Eurasian alliance, it's behaviour like this. I find it massively incomprehensible that anyone from my former profession could have recommended such a foolish action. Certainly there were differences of opinion, major differences of opinion over the Ukraine, but an anniversary occasion like this was surely an occasion to settle that aside and say, notwithstanding our differences over the Ukraine, which are major ones, we wish to do honour to your people's sacrifice in World War II, and that would have been the right thing to do. Anyway, to return to the subject at hand, American sanctions against Russia actually didn't begin over the Ukraine. They began over a Russian lawyer called Magnitsky, who died in prison under mysterious circumstances when he was investigating alleged fraud involving Russian tax officials. I mention this because it's a remarkable example of how the reach of, if you like, moral superiority can extend. Why on earth is the United States sanctioning Russia for something that happens to a Russian lawyer in a Russian prison investigating alleged Russian criminal offences? It's quite remarkable. In return, Russia banned US adoptions. They cited the case of a Russian adopted child who died as a result of alleged neglect in the United States by his American adoptive parents. And so we got into a spiral of tit-for-tat sanctions, which very quickly set up a very bad mood in Russian-American relations. And then, of course, came the war in the Ukraine. So small things can have big beginnings. You know, the War of Jenkins' Ear is an old war that started because the Spanish cut off the ear of a British seaman. Now we have a a thing starting because of a Russian lawyer dying in Russian prison in suspicious circumstances. The present sanctions against Russia are not working well. The idea was target the Russian oligarchs, the people who have property in London, the people who buy their jewellery at Cartier in the West, and make them hurt, and then somehow everything will be rosy. Well, of course, it didn't work that way. Remember the power of emotion in international relations. The Russian people swung massively behind Putin. His approval ratings are now up over 80%. Russia is actively seeking new trade relationships with major non-Western industrial countries, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, and of course there's the idea now of a new Silk Road alliance between Russia and China, which is going to create a massive, powerful continental bloc. And this is all our doing. Russia essentially wanted to be part of a common European home. Whoever hears the expression common European home anymore, it's us versus them, and it's very sad. So I suppose I would put sanctions against Russia down as a failure, a massive failure, along with all the others I've mentioned. And I go into some detail there, which I don't have time to go through, but you can look at it. So we have a situation now where relations are worsening with Russia. New opportunities are being created for a possible anti-Western geostrategic alliance. And Russia will never give back Crimea to the Ukraine, that's quite clear. And every attempt to take the pro-Russian eastern provinces of Ukraine by force, involving shelling of civilians, is going to be met with more Russian covert intervention in defense of those people. These are all facts. And wise men like Henry Kissinger and Mikhail Gorbachev and John Mearsheimer have made these kinds of points over the last 15 months or so. So I'm not alone. But on the other hand, I'm pretty lonely. I think Angela Merkel understands this very well. I think Francois Hollande understands it. But I think there are many people in and around NATO, perhaps particularly on the eastern borders of NATO, who really don't mind this confrontation. They feel safer in a situation of confrontation than in a situation of East-West détente. So these are all very complex questions, and there's no time to go into that here. So let me now offer my conclusions in the couple of minutes remaining to me. Sanctions involve choices between contested models of how we view the world, whether we view the world through Westphalian doctrines of national sovereignty or through support for a United Nations Security Council-based system of collective security, or through a responsibility to protect human rights lens, or through a Monroe-type doctrine that asserts the rights of powerful states to exercise spheres of influence over their near neighbours. We can't entertain all these worldviews at once. They're mutually inconsistent, so choices have to be made. We know enough about sanctions now to know that they're a two-edged, dangerous sword. The states that think they're going to be a painless way of enforcing their strength and will over other states may have to go to war in the end anyway. In Jeffrey Record's words, economic sanctioning can be tantamount to an act of war. Sanctions often proceed from hegemonic attitudes of superiority, which is not a good basis for diplomacy. Sanctions imposed without knowledge of a target nation's security perspectives, history and culture can rapidly worsen relations and make settlement of disputes much more difficult. They can drive a target nation towards undesirable policies and alignments. They can worsen international tensions, and they can raise the risk of war. Only in very rare cases, like apartheid South Africa, do sanctions have good outcomes. Weak sanctions are worse than no sanctions at all. If sanctions are not expected to work, but are simply an expression of opprobrium, they surely should not be attempted. Finally, I'll say something very briefly and tentatively about the arbitrability of sanctions, and you may come to completely different conclusions today. It seems to me that arbitrating in non-UN Security Council sanction situations cannot be an easy matter, because at least one side, or both sides,
are acting outside any agreed mutual framework of international peacetime relations. They are effectively at war under another name. In other words, they've torn up the international relations rule book and they're doing something that is essentially an act of bullying. And they wrap that in things like coalitions of the willing to give it some sort of respectability. But it is actually a group of powerful or more powerful people ganging up on a group or individual who is considered to be less powerful. So where does this leave sanctions arbitrators? It seems to me it leaves you in a difficult situation, rather like a peacemaker venturing with a white flag onto a hotly contested battlefield. If my analysis is accepted that sanctions outside UN Security Council auspices are more often than not exercises of superior force unsupported by international law, then isn't a sanctions arbitrator in a situation of trying to make peace between a bully and his victim? I'm not saying this is impossible. Anything that encourages constructive dialogue, even between bullies and victims, must be a good thing. So, you know, when a teacher's in a playground and sees a gang of bigger boys ganging up on a smaller boy, he has to go and try and break it up. So he's effectively in the role of an arbitrator, I suppose. But he has a little bit more clout than arbitrators have. So I will conclude by saying good luck in your endeavours today, and may I say thank you again to Philip Coe and to all the organisers for giving me the opportunity as a non-expert outsider to come here and address you today.